Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program tonight, Arequipa Sanatorium. We're going to be getting started in just a few moments. We're letting attendees in from the waiting room right now, so we appreciate your patience. We'll be right back with you. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, you're probably in the right place if you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program, Arequipa Sanatorium by Lynn Downey. We're going to be getting started in just a few moments. Again, we have participants entering from the waiting room right now. It is just a minute or so past 5 o'clock, but we will be getting started shortly. Thanks again for your patience. Okay, now it's a few minutes after 5, so I think we'll get started. We can have attendees join us while we're in progress. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Arequipa Sanatorium, Life in California's Lung Resort for Women. It's a live online presentation by Lynn Downey. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. We have more than 130 people registered for this presentation tonight. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program, Arequipa Sanatorium, Life in California's Lung Resort for Women, presented by Lynn Downey. Lynn Downey is a widely published historian of the West. She has degrees in history and library science from San Francisco State University and the University of California, Berkeley. She was the company historian and archivist for Levi Strauss & Company in San Francisco from 1989 to 2014, and her biography of the company's founder, titled Levi Strauss, the Man Who Gave Blue Jeans to the World, was published in 2016 and won the Forward Review's Silver Indie Award for biography. Her other books include A Short History of Sonoma and Arizona's Vulture Mine and Vulture City. She released her first novel in 2020 titled Dudes Rush In. Her next book, A Cultural History of Dude Ranching, will be published in 2022. Lynn now works as a historical archival consultant and writer. Her clients include Sonoma State University, Sonoma County Archives, the Charles M. Schultz Museum, Matson Navigation, and Tomales Regional History Center, among others. Lynn's latest book, and the subject for tonight's talk, Arequipa Sanatorium, Life in California's Lung Resort. As San Francisco recovered from the 1906 earthquake and fire, dust, and ash filled the city's factories, stores, and classrooms, Dr. Philip King Brown noticed rising tuberculosis rates among the women who worked there, and he knew there were places where they could get affordable treatment. In 1911, with the help of society women and his wife, Helen, a protege of philanthropist Phoebe Apperson Hearst, Brown opened the Arequipa Sanatorium in Marin County. Together, Brown and his all-female staff gave new life to hundreds of working-class women suffering from tuberculosis in early 20th century California. Based on sanatorium records Downey helped to preserve and interviews she conducted with former patients and others associated with Arequipa, she tells a vivid story of the sanatorium and its cure that Brown and his talented team of progressive women made possible for hundreds of working class patients. Now, if you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the top of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Lynn Downey and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Lynn, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kevin, so much. And thank you to all of you for coming. Whenever I do these webinars, I always feel like Norma Desmond at the end of the movie Sunset Boulevard. She talks about all those wonderful people out there in the dark. So thank you to all you wonderful people out there in the dark who've come to hear my story tonight. So I grew up in Marin County in the 50s and 60s in the suburb of Marinwood. And my grandparents lived in Sonoma. And all the time I was growing up, my grandmother would tell these stories. And she'd always start the sentence this way: when I was in the sanatorium. And the story involved how cold the place was or how nice the doctors were. And I was a little kid. I enjoyed her stories, but I didn't really ask much about them. Then in 1965, I went to the day camp, the Girl Scout day camp in Fairfax at a place called Arequipa. And there was this big brown shingled building on the property. And they let us little girls wander, screaming through the halls. And I was sort of a little budding historian by this time. And I thought the building was really interesting, but I didn't really ask any questions about it. And as I got older, my grandmother really sort of stopped telling her stories. But then in the 1980s, as the AIDS epidemic took hold and cases of tuberculosis exploded in this country, she started telling her stories again. And so finally, I had a history degree by this time. And I said, Grandma, what is the sanatorium you're talking about? What are these stories about? And she said, well, in 1927, when your father was 2 years old, I got tuberculosis. And Dr. Philip King Brown sent me to his sanatorium called Arequipa, where I got well. And I said, the Girl Scout camp? And she said, well, yes, I remember when it became a Girl Scout camp, and I remember when you went there. So this blew my mind, and I had to find out more about this place. So the first thing I did was sit my grandmother down and interview her about her experience. It was over 2 hours of conversation. Then I decided to go into local libraries to see if I could find anything. And I really didn't find much, except at the Bancroft Library over at UC Berkeley, there were a couple of annual reports. So I was working at the California Historical Society at the time, and the manuscripts curator said, well, if the property's owned by the Girl Scouts, maybe they know where some historical records might be. Maybe there might be some that they found. So I called the Girl Scouts, and they gave me the number of the site manager, a man named Happy Stanton. So I called up Happy Stanton, and I told him my story, and he said, well, when I first started working here, I found boxes of letters and scrapbooks and photographs all over the building. So my next question was, what happened to it? And he said, it all looked really important to me, so I saved it all. And we made an appointment for me to go out to Fairfax, and he took me to a shed and opened up the door, and there was the entire archive of the Arequipa Sanatorium in one room. So I got permission from the Girl Scouts to take everything home to organize it. I was a trained archivist by this time. And then I eventually talked them into donating the entire collection to UC Berkeley, so that's where it is. But I really needed to learn more about this place. And little by little, certainly by going through every single piece of paper and every photo in this archive, I learned everything about Arequipa, which became my book. So it was founded by this man, Dr. Philip King Brown, in 1911. And it was created specifically to teach women, or excuse me, to heal women who had tuberculosis. And this was incredibly rare. In 1911, there were about 400 TB sanatoriums in the United States, and only 4 of them were for women exclusively. So I really need to start with him. Like, who was this Philip King Brown guy, and why did he care so much about women? And I found out the answer very soon. The answer was his mother. His mother was Dr. Charlotte Blake Brown, one of San Francisco's foremost female physicians and surgeons. She was one of the co-founders of Children's Hospital in San Francisco in 1875. She had 3 children, and she raised her children to understand that women deserved health care as good as the kind of health care that men got. And 2 of her 3 children became doctors, and they learned very well from her. So Philip Brown went to Harvard and got his MD. He came back to San Francisco. He married Helen Hillier from San Francisco. Her father was a big mining engineer, spent time in Virginia City, and she was basically the surrogate daughter of Phoebe Apperson Hearst. They had a wonderful home on Van Ness Avenue. He had a thriving practice. Everything was going their way until April 18th, 1906. That's the Brown family home on the right. The steeple from the church next door almost fell in through their skylight. So their house was on Van Ness. It survived the quake, but of course not the fire. The Brown family had means, so they were able to rent another home until they built their new home. Philip King Brown got his practice up and running again. And then he started to notice something. More women than men were coming into his practice with tuberculosis. And it didn't take him long to figure out why. And these women were the working women of the city. They worked in factories, classrooms, stores. They were telephone switchboard operators in tiny little rooms. And all of these places were filled with the detritus of what was left over after the fire and the rebuilding of the city. And it's coming in through the windows and settling in corners, making these women more at risk for lung disease. The men were outdoors, rebuilding the city. There were a lot of men were doing that. And this explained to Dr. Brown why women were getting TB more than men. And there were very few places where these women could go to get treatment. San Francisco General Hospital had tuberculosis wards, but there weren't enough beds for people, and people were just cheek by jowl, and it was really, sort of basic medicine. And what Dr. Brown knew these people needed was a sanatorium. So let's back up a bit. What is tuberculosis? It's a bacterium. It's the tubercle bacillus, the bacterium that gets into the lungs. And it's spread by respiratory droplets in close quarters, and is especially people who have underlying health conditions are especially vulnerable to tuberculosis. Sound familiar? The only solution to having tuberculosis, the only way to get well, because there were no drugs that would kill the tubercle bacillus, the bacterium, was the sanatorium. The sanatorium was a concept that originally came out of Germany and that was perfected in the 1880s by Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau in Saranac Lake, New York. And by 1900, his model of what was called the rest cure devolved into hundreds and hundreds of sanatoriums all over the United States. So the rest cure was literally, that's perfect description of what it was. When you have tuberculosis, you have the bacillus in your lungs. The only way for you to become not contagious and to keep this from killing you is to absolutely lie still and allow the body's immune system to form what my grandmother called scar tissue, or it's called macrophages, around the bacilli in the lungs. It would wall off the contagion. And then you would no longer be coughing up, bacterium-laden breath. You wouldn't be contagious, and the damage to your lungs would stop. And if you lived correctly and healthily for the rest, you could live with the scar tissue in your lungs for the rest of your life. So by resting, the body could heal itself, but only if TB was caught at a certain point. Now, in 1910, there were 135 deaths out of every 100,000 people from tuberculosis. Today in California, there are 143 deaths per 100,000 people from COVID-19. So that's how scary tuberculosis was. Those are almost equivalent deaths per 100,000 people. So Dr. Brown knew there was no place for these women to go. So he says, I'm going to build my own sanatorium. which you could do back in 1910, 1911. So one thing he did was to get in touch with people like Phoebe Apperson Hearst, whom he called Aunt Phoebe, and the other wealthy women of San Francisco who wanted to put their money and their time toward really important causes. And this is the progressive era when a lot of public health measures are coming into play and ordinary people are helping to make those public health measures work. So the other thing he needed was a piece of land. And in the town of Fairfax, a real estate magnate named Henry Bothene had, I think it was 45 acres outside, about a mile outside west of Fairfax. And he gave this land to Philip King Brown so that he could build his sanatorium on it. So think about this. You're the city officials in Fairfax and you find out, or somebody tells you, well, a mile out of town, somebody's going to build a big building and fill it with contagious people. That didn't worry people back in 1910, 1911, because everybody knew someone who'd had tuberculosis. They might have had it themselves. They knew someone who died of tuberculosis and possibly had even had sanatorium treatment. They knew the sanatoriums, first of all, were very clean sanitary places and they kept people alive. So nobody really worried about it. Dr. Brown opened Arequipa in September of 1911. That's the main building there, 1911. A second wing was added in 1913 because there were so many people, so many women who needed care. Now, the meaning of Arequipa has been contested over the years. Before I started doing research, the commonly accepted explanation was, it is a Peruvian word. There's a town in Peru called Arequipa. And people said, well, Philip King Brown went to Harvard, and Harvard has a telescope at Arequipa, Peru. So that's probably where he got the idea. No, I don't buy it. It didn't make any sense to me. He was not in the astrophysics department. So after quite a bit of research, I discovered what I think is the origin of the name of his sanatorium. Philip and Helen Brown had a home in Montecito near Santa Barbara called Miradero, which they actually ran as a sanitarium for a while. They had a next door neighbor, a former South American sea captain named Price Mitchell. And Price Mitchell, his first boat that he piloted around South America was called the Arequipa. And when he retired and moved to Santa Barbara, he and his wife built their home and he decided to name it after his favorite boat, Arequipa. He was Philip King Brown's next door neighbor. And he explained to Dr. Brown that the name meant place of peace or place of rest in the Quechuan indigenous Peruvian language. I think that's the reason. If somebody wants to find a record to contradict me, send me an email. So Arequipa opens in September of 1911. Now you can't see in this photo, but all of these windows have screens only. There were only doors. The only windows with glass were in the kitchens. That's because part of the rest cure is to have free flowing air all the time for these women to be breathing. And the entire cure was breathing, lying in bed and resting, and also eating a lot of food to put weight back on the body. Because one of the symptoms of TB is drastic weight loss. And if you're gaining weight, it means you're getting better. But from the very first, the staff at Arequipa were all women. The nurses were all women, of course, and that was typical of 1911. But a lot of the visiting physicians were women. Now, when Arequipa opened, there was a resident physician, a woman named Dr. Hattie Bedortha, but it was really hard to get a doctor to actually come and live on site because these doctors also had their own practices. So Dr. Brown created this sort of a rota of visiting physicians, and these women would alternate days and times. They would go to Arequipa, they would examine the patients, they would do some of the medical treatments, and just keep an eye on everybody. And of course, rely very heavily on their nurses. One of the doctors was Dr. Emma Willits. She got her MD at Northwestern and then came out to San Francisco to work at Children's Hospital, where the hospital Charlotte Brown had founded. Another was Dr. Ethel Owen, who was one of the first women to get a medical degree at Stanford. She also went to France during World War I and worked as a doctor on the front lines and was decorated by the government of France for her services to the nation during the war. The final doctor who came by quite a lot was Dr. Adelaide Brown, Philip King Brown's sister, who somebody should write a whole book about her. She was fascinating. But her special contribution to public health, especially in the years after the earthquake, was cleaning up the milk supply in San Francisco. Tuberculosis and other diseases could be spread by milk. And, dairy cows that might have TB, their milk was coming in from, outlying areas, being served to school children in San Francisco, being sold in stores. So she did a huge campaign to test dairy cows and make sure that the milk that was sold and drunk in San Francisco was clean. And she did the same thing for the dairy that was on site at Arequipa. Now, Philip Brown knew these women. He'd met some of them while his mother was still alive. And a lot of them had offices in the same building he did, which was at 909 Hyde Street in San Francisco, right next to St. Francis Hospital. So that's how he met them. And these women had a deep commitment to this treatment. They all had thriving practices. But, before the Golden Gate Bridge was built, getting from San Francisco to Fairfax was quite the multiple transportation ordeal. So to do this 2 or 3 times a week was a deep commitment on these women's parts. So there was a big tradition of occupational therapy in tuberculosis sanatoria. Dr. Brown knew this, but he didn't want his women to just be lying in bed, what he called making gym cracks, crocheting or knitting. So he got really ambitious and he decided to offer pottery as occupational therapy for his patients. Now, there's sort of various levels of cure. When you first go into the sanatorium, you're very sick, you don't move, you don't get out of your bed. And little by little, you get more ambulatory until you're very close to being discharged. And so the pottery making was intended to give this a creative outlet to the women who were very close to the end of their cure and might be getting a little bit restless because they really want to go home. So he built this pottery shed, which you see here. It also had screens. And he hired over the next few years a succession of professional ceramic masters to teach these women how to make pottery. All the heavy work of lugging the clay around and firing it was done by staff members and some boys from a convalescent place across the hill. But the women did the decorating, they chose the glazes. And then Dr. Brown went one step further. He arranged with department stores and bookstores in San Francisco, like Nathan Dorman and the White House and Paul Elder's bookstore, to sell the pottery that these women made. And that way they could make a little bit of money with their art and help pay for their cure. He was literally putting their cure in their own hands. And the pottery was very, very popular. So he had to get the word out. And the pottery opened just 2 months after Arequipa opened in 1911. Then in 1915, during the Panama Pacific International Exposition, Arequipa had this huge booth at the PPIE in the Palace of Education, I believe. Women who had left Arequipa but had shown proficiency with the pottery, they were brought back. They demonstrated pottery making. They sold their wares. The women at Arequipa made their pottery. It was sent to the booth to be sold. Again, they could make money. The women who worked the booth made a little bit of money. So it was, again, another way to make this link between art and commerce in the service of healing. So by about 1916, Dr. Brown added tile making into the repertoire. He hired a man whose main skill was and knowledge was in tile making. And that's when they devised this beautiful, beautiful logo, which was either stamped or carved onto the bottom of the vases and bowls and then carved into the back of the tiles. They stopped making pottery about 1921. After World War I, prices for all of the raw materials just got to be too expensive. And it was really hard to get someone to commit to living in very rural Marin County on site, for a year or more at a time. But Dr. Brown didn't want to, give up on it, as we'll see in just a couple of minutes. So when you have TB, you don't get to just take the rest cure. You have to have occasionally a few medical interventions. And the most common was something called pneumothorax, which is artificially collapsing the lung. So if you collapse the lung, you're not breathing with it, it's not working. And those macrophages can really start working and getting deformed around those bacilli. So this is how this works. You lay down on a table, they slap some Novocaine on your back. The end of this hose has a needle, they jab the needle between your ribs and then inject nitrogen into the pleural cavity around the lung. And this would just collapse the lung. Then you would stagger off the table and go back to bed. This was called getting gas. And it wouldn't last in your body for a long time, a matter of days or a week or so. It would eventually pass out of your body and the lung would reinflate. But sometimes women had to have this over and over, especially if they had hemorrhages, which meant that their lungs were just not healing. And it was just this way to stop the lung from working so nature could take its course. There were more drastic interventions. The worst was probably thoracoplasty, in which a rib was permanently removed from your body to permanently collapse the lung. And in that case, surgeries like that were done at the Cottage Hospital in San Rafael. They could not do surgery like that at Arequipa, but they could do pneumothorax. Now, the women also got a lot of x-rays. I don't know how these women didn't glow in the dark after all of the x-rays that they got in their time at Arequipa, but it was the only way to really gauge the progress of what was going on in the lung. And doctors also used the fluoroscope. So if you think about old-timey cartoons, like an animal goes behind the screen and you see the dancing skeleton on the screen, that was the fluoroscope. And that way the doctors could see the lung in real time, working in real time as well. So those were the only tools they had to be able to move the women toward their cure. And using these tools allowed them to individualize the cure for each woman, depending on what stage of the disease they were in. So in the early years, visitors were encouraged to come visit. Bring your family, bring your friends, bring a picnic lunch, which seems so counterintuitive. But this was a very healthy, clean, sanitary place. The air was flowing through. If you were really sick, really early in your cure, you weren't allowed to have visitors. But again, especially you had your temperature taken quite a lot during the day as well. And if you went for days and days without a fever, it meant that the infection was those macrophages were working and you were getting less and less contagious, and it was more proper for you to be able to receive visitors. Again, there was just no threat of contagion. And the people of Fairfax basically adopted Arequipa. There was a piano at the sanatorium, there was a record player, and local girls in the 20s, they would come and somebody would play a record and they would demonstrate the latest dance moves, or somebody would come and play the piano for the patients. And then during World War I, it was hard for the superintendent to get bulk purchases of fruit for the women to eat, because a lot of the fruit was going toward the war effort. And so the residents of Fairfax heard about this, and they would regularly go in their backyards and pick loquats and grapes, and they'd go down to the creek and pick blackberries, and they would bring this fruit up to the sanatorium for the women so they could have fruit during this time of deprivation. So as I mentioned, the pottery had to close about 1921, but Dr. Brown did not give up on therapy, occupational therapy. Basically, the women did that on their own. They would lie in bed, they would crochet, they would knit, and that was fine. But he started to offer vocational therapy. He taught women how to be lab technicians. He taught them stenography and typing. And a lot of women left Arequipa with new careers. They wouldn't have to go back to the factory, with poorly lit factory, with the closed windows. They could have a new career. They were taught something new at Arequipa to take into the rest of their lives. The nurses also gave a lot of lectures, well, so did the doctors, about not just getting well, but staying well when they went home. Dr. Brown always said, Arequipa is a school, because the women had to learn how to get well so they wouldn't get TB again and have to come back for the tour. So things like the flapper lifestyle of the 1920s, that drinking and smoking and staying out late, none of this flapper stuff if you want to prevent tuberculosis. Although doctors did think that the looser dresses of the flappers were much better for breathing than, these women who were still wearing corsets, even in the 20s. And even fashion had a role in TB prevention. Dr. Brown gave an interview to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1922, and he said this: "Short skirts do not sweep up germ-laden dirt from the streets. In that way, they are an aid in the prevention of disease. So shorten those skirts, girls." The other thing that Dr. Brown encouraged his patients to do was to create their own magazine or newsletter. And this was also very common in sanatoria. So it was a creative outlet. It was a way to keep the women busy, but not in a way that would endanger their health. So there were 3 different iterations of newsletters or newspapers at Arequipa. The first one was called High Life. And this is a page from, I believe, the September 1921 issue of High Life. And there's a lot going on here. So on the left-hand side, there's a man with a doctor's bag and he's eating something. Dr. Brown loved apple pie. So it's a picture of Dr. Brown with his medical bag coming by on Tuesdays and eating apple pie at the same time. On the right, you see a skinny woman and a fat woman. And the concept here is that the fat woman is a heck of a lot healthier than that skinny woman because she's getting better because she's putting on weight. And there were all kinds of jokes throughout these newsletters about, you know, so-and-so went down to get weighed and almost broke the scale, yay. And this is what it was like. You know, you were living in this world within a world and the rules were different, you know, in a sanatorium, and you wanted to get that. My favorite part is the one at the top. Ethel Steeves was a nurse that everyone loved. She was just beloved. And she, in the spring, she went on a vacation to Hawaii. So everybody missed her terribly. So the artist for this issue drew this picture of Ethel Steeves, and she's on the beach at Waikiki. And you can't see it, but she has a thought bubble and it says Arequipa. Yeah, she's on the beach at Waikiki and all she can think about is Arequipa. So these were very popular and very delightful. In 1927, Dr. Brown's second son, Cabot Brown, the only one of his 4 children to become a doctor, joined the staff at Arequipa. He was also a Harvard-educated doctor. He joined his father's practice and decided to also specialize in pulmonary diseases. So he spent a lot of time, did a lot of rotations at Arequipa. And in 1927, someone else showed up at Arequipa, a young mother named Lois Downey, otherwise known as Grandma, shown here on the porch of her home in Sonoma with a little kid called Harvey, otherwise known as my dad. In the summer of 1927, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Her doctor said she was very sick and she needed to rest. Well, she had a toddler. Her husband, my grandfather, worked all day. She couldn't rest. And by November, she was very, very ill. And her doctor told her, you are terminal. And the only thing that's going to save your life is to go to a sanatorium. And she and my grandfather were aghast, like, we don't have money, we're working class, you know, we can't pay for a sanatorium. But her doctor told her, oh no, Dr. Brown created Arequipa to be affordable. In the first like 15 or 20 years, it was $1 a day to stay at Arequipa, and that covered everything. So that made them feel a little bit better. And they drove to San Francisco, where Dr. Philip King Brown himself examined my grandmother. She brought her x-rays, he took additional x-rays, talked to her, looked at them, and then went in the waiting room to talk to my grandfather. He said, your wife has 3 months to live, and we can't take terminal patients at Arequipa because A, they usually don't benefit from the rest cure, and B, it's, you know, death is demoralizing to those women who are on the way to their cure. And my grandfather basically made a deal with Dr. Philip King Brown. He said, would you please just take her for 3 months? And if she doesn't get any better, I'll take her home to die. And Dr. Brown broke his own rule. He had a bed available, and he sent my grandmother to Arequipa that very day. So she went in November of 1927, and she spent 14 months in her bed, obeying every rule, determined not to die because she did not want her mother-in-law to raise her son. He had other reasons, but that was the main one. Cabot Brown was her main physician at Arequipa. She loved him. Philip King Brown was warm, but there was a bit of a reserve. Cabot Brown, when he walked into the wards, it was like a golden retriever. It was bounding around, saying hello to everybody. He was warm and outgoing and funny, and just his presence made everybody feel better. And my grandmother really loved him. I think she had a bit of a crush on him. They were about the same age. But he gave her a lot of personal talks during her time. And when it was time to leave, he gave her a lecture about what she had to do at home to take care of herself, what she had to do emotionally, as well as physically and medically. This sort of whole body, mind, attitude to make sure that she did not have to come back to Arequipa. So in February of 1929, she posed in front of this hydrangea bush and went home to go on with the rest of her life after 14 months of lying in bed. So in the 1930s, Dr. Philip Brown stepped away from the day-to-day running of Arequipa, and Cabot Brown really took over those duties. And in about 1932, he started hiring male doctors for the first time. And one of the first men he hired was this man, Dr. Lloyd Dickey. Dr. Dickey's specialty was pediatrics. And that's because about the same time, Cabot Brown had started admitting girls to Arequipa, children. Because children were getting TB just like adults were. It was very hard to find sanatorium treatment for children. There were places called preventoriums, kind of like country living, outdoor living for kids who are at risk for TB. They could spend time outdoors, get exercise and good food, and maybe keep them from getting the disease. But when they did, there were so few places for them to go. So we started admitting young girls. And one of them joined the Arequipa right after her 14th birthday in 1940. And her name was Rose. Rose was born in San Francisco. Her family had come from China in the early 1880s, had lived in San Francisco for generations, but she was raised in Watsonville. And when she was 13, her mother died of tuberculosis. And her father was an itinerant worker. And she was the youngest, I believe the youngest in the family. And so she still had a few siblings at home. And just before she turned 14, it was discovered that she had a very, very bad case of tuberculosis. And her doctor knew about Arequipa and arranged to get her in there in June of 1940. So Rose's story is another wonderful aspect of this whole history. This is a photo. Rose is second from the right in the back. I call this the United Nations photo. There was no racial discrimination at Arequipa. If you were female and you had TB, you could go to Arequipa. So from the beginning, there were Asian American, Latinx, and Black patients at Arequipa from day one. There were at least 2 Asian American women when my grandmother was there in 1927. So these were some of Rose's fellow girls. They're out there, taking a group photo. Rose spent 7 years at Arequipa. She almost died many times, and Cabot Brown was determined that she was not going to die. And so did one of the other doctors there, Dr. Thomas Wiper. It was just like, she's not dying, and they made sure she didn't. And after about 5 years, she really was ready to go home, but she had no place to go. Her father was still not living at home. Her siblings had all married and scattered. So Cabot Brown gave her a job and a bed at Arequipa, and she did the typing, she swept the floors, he taught her laboratory technology until she felt ready to go out in the world when she was about 21. And she went on, she went into government service, she married, and eventually moved to Washington, D.C. and worked for many years for the Small Business Administration. And the reason I'm able to tell Rose's story in such detail is because in 2018, as I was working on this manuscript, one of Rose's doctors found me online and wanted to introduce me because all Rose ever talked about was her time at Arequipa. So over the course, in the spring of 2018, over the course of many phone calls and furious note-taking, I got Rose's story down on paper and I got it into the book. And it was such a privilege for me to do that. And then in August of 2018, I flew to DC to meet Rose, who was a kick in the pants, remembered everything about her time at Arequipa. After the book came out, she would tell me stories and be like, Rose, why didn't you tell me that before? Having Rose in my life was like having my grandmother back. And Rose unfortunately passed away this past January at the age of 94. And I will be eternally grateful that I met her. My book would be all the poorer without her story. And also in this same time, I met descendants of Philip King Brown, who I also now count as friends. So this is wonderful outgrowth of doing this project. Philip King Brown died in October of 1940, and Cabot fully took over management of Arequipa. In doing so, he made a lot of changes. He turned Arequipa more into a hospital, a regimented hospital, rather than the sort of more open-minded sanatorium. There were no more visitors. In the 80s, I met 2 women who'd been patients at Arequipa in the late 40s and early 50s. One woman said that when her husband and children came to visit, she had to lean out the window from the 2nd floor to talk to her children who were down on the patio. So it was much more regimented. And a lot was going on with tuberculosis in the 1940s. One was Christmas seals and Easter seals. This was money that was raised for TB treatments and TB research. These mobile X-ray trucks went all over rural America and would pull into your town. You could get a chest X-ray and they would send you the results and might catch incipient tuberculosis for you simply because these mobile trucks came into, Alturas, up in way Northern California. Something else was happening in the 40s. Streptomycin was discovered in 1944, I believe. And it was found to be the first drug that would kill the tubercle bacillus. And the first patients at Arequipa got streptomycin for the first time in 1947. Now, at the same time, another drug called PAS was discovered in Scandinavia. Both of these drugs were being used, but unfortunately, doctors discovered that the bodies developed resistance to these very quickly, like antibiotic resistance. So that was kind of a drag, but streptomycin and PAS were still being given to people. And then in 1948, a combination of drugs was created called isoniazid, and it was the silver bullet that killed the bacillus. The body didn't develop resistance to it, and it was a life changer and a paradigm shifter for the treatment of tuberculosis. Now, Cabot was really happy about these drugs, but he also believed in the rest cure. One of those former patients told me a story. I think it was 1951 or 52. Life magazine ran a story about these new drugs, anti-TB drugs, and had this picture of these women in bathrobes dancing down a hallway of their sanatorium. They're so happy because now they're going to get to take drugs instead of having to lie in bed. So this patient showed this magazine to Cabot Brown, and he looks at it and he sniffs. They were my patients. They would dance right back then. And that's what he truly believed. He believed there was a place for both. And so many of his Arequipa patients were taking the drugs as they took the rest cure, but women were leaving Arequipa. They could get drugs as outpatients, and they were getting better at home. So by 1955 or so, there were only 8 deaths per 100,000 population, down from 135 just 30 years earlier. So TB rates were just plummeting, and that was good public health measures and the new antibiotics. So Cabot Brown saw the writing on the wall, and he closed Arequipa for good in 1957. In 1960, the Girl Scouts acquired the property, which is why I was there as a Girl Scout in 1965. And it is still the Arequipa Day Camp today. So after I did my interview with my grandmother, I took her back to Arequipa. She walked in the building, walked in the door, turned a corner, turned around and pointed and said, "That's where my bed was," without hesitation, 50 years after leaving Arequipa. She really was happy that day. I just got it. It's a bad picture. She was just grinning from ear to ear. And in this photo, she's 79. So in 1927, she was given 3 months to live. She spent 14 months at Arequipa, and she died in 2006 at the age of 102. To the end of her days, giving Philip King Brown, Cabot Brown, and Arequipa the credit for saving her life and teaching her how to live. And I truly believe that with her. So Arequipa has been this gift my whole life. It saved my grandmother's life. I got to have her my entire life until 2006. I got the privilege of being able to tell this story because records were left behind and saved by this site manager, Happy Stanton. But the real gift was what 3 generations of the Brown family gave to the women of California. Charlotte Brown taught her children that women deserved the best of medical care. Philip Brown had the vision to open a sanatorium just for the working women of California who were suffering because of their work and to give them a place to get better. And Cabot Brown, who carried on his father's work, modernized Arequipa, and then knew when it was time to hand over tuberculosis treatment to a new generation. So that's the story I have had the great privilege of telling. And I want to end with a quotation from Karina Green. Karina Green was a reporter for the Independent Journal, but she was also in the public relations department of the Girl Scouts. And when the Girl Scouts took over the property in 1960, this is what she said about the transition. So 50 years later, the profile of Arequipa changes, but not the heart nor the intent. The early pioneers and patients returning now surely would see only progress in the program about to be launched at the site, a program designed to produce happy, healthy young women ready to take their place in the American scene. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm back, Lynn. That was so incredible. I have 3 pages of notes that I took while listening to your talk, and I just want to start by first saying, if you have audience, if you have questions or comments, please put them up in the chat and the Q&A now. I'm going to start looking through those and asking them or sharing them with Lynn. First, I want to say thank you. That was so fascinating.
Thank you.
Disclosure, I worked for the American Lung Association in California for 3 years.
Wow.
In a life before coming to the book club. And as you know, tuberculosis was part of what founded the American Lung Association, or what became the American Lung Association. So lung health and tuberculosis talk in the history has been part of my job for a long period of time. But I really didn't know much at all about this whole sanatorium life, and the fact that I think you said there were 400 TB sanatoriums across the country, not many for women, a very small number for women. But I mean, it was just fascinating to learn that that whole thing was happening, right? That this existed, this exists for people. And of course, I think there's some comments in the chat, but I want to thank you for sharing your story, like your personal connection to Arequipa and to lung disease and tuberculosis, and to why we have this book, this terrific book. It's so incredible. I've already bought it, as you know, so I can't wait to read it. It's on the way. And we'll share that with other folks, at the end of the talk, on how you can get a copy of the book. But I want to talk a little bit about first, like the process of working on the book. How long did you work on this project?
Well, if you count from the day I interviewed my grandmother, that was 1983, and the book came out in 2019.
Wow.
I wrote a lot of, takes me a while. I wrote a lot of articles about Arequipa, and then Arequipa pottery is sort of a subset of the story, and a lot of people know about that. I actually own 4 pieces of the pottery. I'm lucky to be able to pick them up. I co-wrote the catalog for a big exhibit about pottery at the Oakland Museum in 2000. So it was little by little, I did a little at a time, but it wasn't until I retired from my job at Levi Strauss & Co. that I actually had the time to sit down and write a book. So but I had, boxes of notes. It was all there. I just had to put it together.
Yeah. So some of the photos that were used were so incredible. The pottery studio photo is great. I mean, who took the photos? Do you know, was there a photographer on site? Were they just family photos, or?
Most of those are in the archives over at Bancroft at UC Berkeley. There was no attribution about the photographs. Dr. Brown might have had those done for publicity. A couple of the photos were published in some magazines at the time, so he probably had them professionally done so they can go into these magazines. But some of them are a little more candid. And then I found photos on eBay. I had when I was giving my talk about my grandmother, the picture of the nurse, that was from her collection, obviously the family photos. And so I just sort of looked around and found a few for myself, but almost everything here is either from the sanatorium's archives, San Francisco Public Library, California Historical Society as well.
Yeah, the amazing
and the Brown family too.
Yeah,
actually, the Brown family too.
I was going to say that amazing picture of the Brown family home next to the church and the fire. Like, oh my God, that is an incredible photo. But of course, your grandmother in front of the hydrangea bush is an incredible photo as well. There's so many great images that you used in the presentation. I'm assuming they're in the book, or many of them are in the book as well.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, great. So I'm guessing a lot of your research happened at the UC Berkeley archives.
Well, most of the research was done with the stuff when it was in my house before I gave it. Let's just say I made a lot of photocopies before I turned everything over to Bancroft. I would occasionally have to go over there to do some research. They have a fabulous collection of correspondence between Dr. Philip King Brown and one of the first women who helped out at the pottery, who actually taught the women basket making before there was even pottery. And the correspondence between the two of them, her name was, oh my gosh, what was her? Inez Mexia. And she became a renowned botanist here in California.
So there's a couple of questions, which I'd love to ask you, all of them, about the pottery, the whole thing about the pottery studio and someone mentions that Arequipa pottery is highly collectible among arts and crafts collectors these days. And actually, I've heard of of the pottery. I didn't realize it was connected to this sanatorium. So it's weird. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that all came about, where they got the instructors, how many women were actually making pottery in the studio?
It's tough to tell from the annual reports how many women actually did work in the pottery. The first pottery master or the pottery director was Frederick Reed, who was an Englishman. And it was the man who invented fiesta ware. If you know fiesta ware, that's Frederick Reed. And he was actually in California in between jobs and heard about Dr. Brown's desire to create a pottery on site. And they set up a deal. And he was there for 3 years, and then he left. And then Dr. Brown hired Albert Solon from a very renowned French-English ceramics family. Can't remember how he found him, but the ceramicists would hear about Arequipa. So Dr. Brown would meet them, and then at some point he knew that he needed a new pottery director. He got in touch with Albert Solon. If you remember the old California Academy of Sciences, the tiled pool where the alligators were when you first went in, those were tiles from Albert Solon's Solon and Schemmel business in San Jose, which he started up after he left Arequipa in 1960.
Wow.
And then Fred Wild was the tile guy, and Dr. Brown met him. He would just write letters to these men, and offer them jobs. And and he was an Englishman, so we had all these sort of international connections with pottery. And they would, every once in a while, there would be like some woman who had incredible skill, and sometimes the ceramic directors would spend a little more time with them. Frederick Reed did that. He actually started doing more of his own pottery, and Helen Brown thought he was just a disaster and wanted him gone because he wasn't concentrating on the women. It was all about the women. And so people didn't really know that much about Arequipa pottery. I think it really began to be known maybe in the 70s, but when she passed away in 1990, Dr. Philip King Brown's only daughter, Phoebe Hearst Brown, gave her entire collection of Arequipa pottery to the Oakland Museum. Which is why they had a big retrospective in 2000. So it's not all of it's on display, but they have her entire collection, and it's phenomenal, pieces of pottery. When I started doing research, this is in the early 80s, Arequipa pottery was already expensive. It was already, now it's like ridiculous. But I managed to meet, in my research, I'd meet pottery people and they say, well, so-and-so has a piece for sale. And so that's how I found the 4 pieces that I have.
Yeah, well, you answered a couple of questions from one of our members, Susan, about where you can see some of this pottery, right, and where you might be able to buy it. So super interesting. Was the existence of these artistic and vocational training programs unique to Arequipa, or were other sanatoriums doing those kinds of programs as well?
Dr. Brown got the idea to do pottery from an institution in Marblehead, Massachusetts called the Devereux Mansion. And it was not a tuberculosis sanatorium. It was more of a place for like nervous people. But they started a pottery program as occupational therapy, and it was so successful commercially, they spun it off as a commercial operation. But it began as this mental and occupational therapy. And Dr. Brown heard about that. He also got in touch with famous female ceramists who wrote for ceramic magazines and had their own businesses, and got ideas from them about what he should buy. How do you start a pottery, in rural Marin County. So he had a way of finding the right people at the right time, and a lot of that was his social standing and his personal confidence. And he was, all right, I'm going to do this, and I would like to ask you how to do it. That's the kind of person he was.
So you mentioned a couple of things about, I wrote a lot of notes about women doctors and when men doctors came in, but tell us about the staff. Like, how many people were working to keep Arequipa going? Medical staff, ground staff, right? All kinds of instructors.
Yeah, again, with annual reports, it's tough to know how big the nursing staff was. There were always probably about 4 or 5 nurses, and then as the years went on, maybe more. that lived on site.
Mm.
Eventually in the late 40s, a big, beautiful new dormitory was built for the nurses right there on the property. There was always the superintendent, and she was in charge of managing the staff, buying supplies, et cetera. There was a head nurse, and then she had like her underlings under her. There were groundskeepers. There were young men who were basically the kitchen staff. They would deliver the trays. You had to eat in bed. And they would deliver the trays and take them away. There were the young men who would sweep the floors. So there was definitely a huge staff. At the very beginning, they grew a lot of their own produce. And again, they had a dairy, so they had like the farming staff. But a lot of that information that might have been part of this archive was lost. The very specific, I didn't find any, pay stubs or, financial records of, when so-and-so was paid or whatever. But, they could only accommodate about 40 to 45 patients at a time. So it's a pretty small place. At first they could accommodate only 24, and then the waiting list was so huge, they built that second wing in 1915. So there were about 45 patients.
You must be able to see my notes. That was my next question. How many patients or how many beds were there, like at one time, to keep that going? So yeah.
And also some of the women were subsidized. One thing that Philip King Brown did early on is he would go to San Francisco and he'd go into big companies, including Levi Strauss & Co. And he would talk to employers. He'd say, look, if one of your employees gets tuberculosis, if you pay for them to get treatment at Arequipa, and it might just be a few months, you will get back a fully healthy, experienced employee. You'll get somebody back that you need instead of having to hire somebody new, train them. This is better for you. And so the telephone company, the Emporium, and a couple of other San Francisco companies regularly paid for their employees to get treatment at Arequipa. And there were some charity cases. The community chest would often pay for the treatment of some patients. It was very affordable, but not everybody could even afford, the very low fee. As far as I know, nobody was turned away because they couldn't pay. And sometimes I know that sometimes the doctors threw some money at the patients just because they want to give them an extra month, so they needed that one extra month, to get them over the top.
Right. So I think you said it was like $1 a day or something like that to stay there.
At the beginning, that it was $1.50 a day, probably by the 40s.
Yeah.
And that covered everything.
Yeah, that's incredible. So that you've answered, again, you're looking at my notes or you're peeking in the Q&A because there was a question about how is it financially viable, right? How did it continue to operate? Were there charitable donations? And clearly there were, solicitations to subsidize the ongoing operation of the sanatorium.
A lot of the women, the wealthy matrons who helped fund Arequipa in the beginning also gave a lot of money for upkeep. So they didn't have to worry about that cost. The wing was completely paid for by a woman who was the heir to the Goodyear tire fortune. And she donated the entire wing, everything, in the memory of her father.
Wow.
Another patient paid for the upgrades at the pottery because she was specifically interested in the pottery. Another one paid for the whole place to get painted and recover the furniture and put up new paintings. Because they also really believed that physically, the physical appearance of the sanatorium was part of the cure. I mean, and also, these women the nurses could take their chairs or their beds, they could roll them out there were balconies, and they could roll out on the balconies on nice days and just look at the beautiful Marin Hills, all day long. What's wrong with that? Nothing.
So there's a question about, I guess, the average stay for a patient at Arequipa, and I'm not sure. Can you speak to that? I think there are people who are there for a brief period of time, but like you said, Rose was there 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
She was 5 years in full treatment. It really depended on your disease. It was the reports would give sort of the number of months of stay for blocks of patients, but there really wasn't an average because it really depended on where you were in your disease. Some women would go, and if they had just 2 months of the rest cure, they were fine because their TB was caught early. Then there was my grandmother, very near to terminal, 14 months lying on her back and on her side without moving. I mean, she, never got up. And some women did have to stay for years but there were deaths. There was a death when my grandmother was there, and there was a death when one of the women I met in the 80s had been there as well. So it didn't always work. But it could be sometimes 2 months would work. Sometimes you'd need to be there for 3 years or even more.
Yeah. Can you tell us some questions about the actual facilities still? Like, are the buildings still there? All of that. And what were the buildings made out of? How did they build all of that stuff up in there?
Um, the John Bakewell was the architect. He was part of the famed San Francisco architectural firm Bakewell and Brown, and he drew the plans for Arequipa and donated them. He didn't charge anybody for them, and he created that brown shingle building, which was very, very Berkeley, very California vernacular, architectural vernacular for 1911. It was a big, wooden building, wooden floors. Again, huge windows with screens. My grandmother said during the winters, they'd have to put newspaper between the mattress and the box springs to keep the cold air from like rising up and like freezing in their beds. And on foggy days, the fog would come all the way in, and she couldn't even see 2 beds away. There would be so much fog in the sanatorium. So anyway, so it was very simple construction, and it was put up very quickly. There was an earthquake, a big earthquake in the Bay Area in 1957. It had a little bit of damage, but it was okay. And it was just before it closed. I managed to get in the building and see it again with my grandmother in November of 1983. In 1984, we had 2 years of record rains here in the Bay Area, and the foundation was beginning to go. And they were still letting little Girl Scouts run through the building. And so the Scouts decided we better get rid of this building, and they tore it down in 1984, unfortunately. However, I did get a reporter from the Independent Journal to interview my grandmother about Arequipa before they tore the building down. She carried that clipping in her purse to the day she died. Unfortunately, the building is not there. The foundations are still there. The superintendent's cottage is still there, and it's also original. And has been upgraded. It's where the current superintendent lived. The pottery buildings were long gone. So if you didn't know there had been a sanatorium there, you wouldn't have any idea, unfortunately.
Can people go visit the site, or is there any markers?
It is a Girl Scout camp. It is a Girl Scout camp. I will say, when I was writing my book, I hadn't been there for decades, and I decided I need to go back. So I drove there. And the Girl Scouts hold a camp there, but they also rent out the space to groups to have like big group events. So I went there, and there are these big stone pillars that actually Henry Bothine donated in 1916. That's how long those have been there. And there was no chain across the place, and I could see there was a big fence. So I just drove onto the property like I own the place. And I drove up the hill to where the sanatorium used to be. There is a bench dedicated to Philip King Brown that his wife put up when he died, and it's still there. And it's right by one of the little camps. So I wandered around, and I know where the hydrangea bush was, where the picture of my grandmother was taken.
Nice.
I don't recommend that because basically I was trespassing. But if you called the Girl Scouts and told them you were interested in the history, there are people who work at the Girl Scouts who are also affiliated with the Fairfax Historical Society, and they'll be very happy to tell you more about the place. So if you contact the Northern California Girl Scout Council, I think you can even go to the Arequipa Day Camp website, or Camp Arequipa, I think that's what it's called, and you could talk to them.
Great.
Don't trespass. No.
Don't trespass.
No.
We're telling you here. It's being recorded. It's a couple of minutes after 6 o'clock, but there are a couple of other questions I want to get in here before we break for the evening. And one of them had to do with the cure rate. Were there a lot of, what was the success rate, I guess, for patients at Arequipa?
Again, records are spotty.
Yeah.
And they didn't really relate their cure rates to admissions. So it's really hard to tell. But in 1922, they'd hired a social worker for a few years, and she did a survey, and they discovered at least in 1922, they went back to a lot of former patients, and the ones who would talk to them and the ones they could find, they did some work and realized that I think it was 70% of former patients were still alive and thriving. And that's pretty good.
Yeah,
for the 1920s.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I was fascinated when you said, because I wrote all these notes, like when you said finally they started letting in children, young girls, And then, of course, she talked about how it was multicultural, right? Which was so amazing to see that. So, and they didn't turn anyone away for the lack of ability to pay. So were most of the women who came there local? Like how far away were women coming? Because there weren't a lot of sanatoriums for women still at the time. So were they Bay Area? Or they
They mostly were Bay Area. There were a lot of tuberculosis sanatoria in Southern California because of the weather. The weather was so good. So a lot of women, they had more opportunities to go to a sanatorium. It would be the mixed gender sanatorium. And the men and women were separated in these mixed genders. I mean, there was a woman's wing and a man's wing. So there were more opportunities for Southern California. The only other sanatoria in the Bay Area, in Sonoma County, there was a sanatorium in Santa Rosa. I think it opened in 1933. There was another one in Livermore. But Arequipa was close to San Francisco. And so I would say most of the women came from San Francisco. And Dr. Brown originally intended Arequipa for the working women of California. And they did, those same social workers did a survey when they did their work in 1922. And it was determined that the vast majority of occupations of women in Arequipa were housewives. These are women who are not working in factories, they're not working in stores, they're at home and they're getting tuberculosis. And I think that was probably they said it was a surprise to them to see how many, self-determined housewives, as opposed to factory workers, hat makers, whatever, were in Arequipa.
So there's a great comment here about the healthy lifestyles that the women were encouraged to lead after leaving the sanatorium. How did that work?
Well, it changed over the years. When my grandmother left in 1929, the Dr. Cabot Brown said, he knew that she'd had some emotional problems with her mother-in-law. He said, you have to resolve those. And he told her, sleep with the windows open, eat really good food, get some exercise, just sort of common sense, take care of yourself stuff. Then after Cabot Brown was in charge of Arequipa, he told the women in the 1940s and 1950s, when they went home, they had to have separate utensils, separate cups and saucers and plates from their family. They had to sit far away from their family when they had meals. They had to, and on top of getting lots of fresh air, make sure you eat well, take your medication, whatever. It was very much more about germs. And it was less about sort of the lifestyle. Earlier, Philip King Brown was more about this whole, mind, body, lifestyle thing. But with Cabot Brown, and, to his credit, he was right, for like 6 months, just eat separately from your family, sleep separately from your husband, don't hug your children, for months. And then, gradually go back into your life. And no smoking, even though Cabot Brown was a chain smoker. He would go ballistic if any of his patients were smoking. So like, don't smoke. That's in the 50s.
Were there any kind of groundbreaking or new treatments that came out of Arequipa, or as part of the whole?
They did host some experimental treatments that went nowhere, but Philip King Brown was open to having that, to having those, take place. One was the use of this thing called chalmugra oil, which had been used successfully to treat leprosy. And they thought that maybe if it was injected intramuscularly, it could help kill the tubercle bacilli. No, it didn't. It didn't do any harm, but it didn't do any good. But Dr. Brown was open to anything that would cure tuberculosis.
Oh my God, there's so many great questions here. I'm going to squeeze one more in. What was the name of the treatment of the lung that caused it to collapse? The getting the gas? I think
pneumothorax. Pneumothorax.
So for
artificial pneumothorax.
Artificial pneumothorax. What's so complicated?
Yeah, my grandmother had that a lot. She
Wow.
talked a lot about
Sounds so painful.
Oh yeah.
I mean, yeah, that sounds painful. Not as nice as sitting on the balcony looking at the Marin Hills in terms of treatment and care. There are some wonderful comments in the chat and in the Q&A that I'll send to you because they're all personal.
Thank you.
The people who know you or who have had similar experiences with their family members who were in the sanatoriums. So definitely will send those to you so you can check those out, and even get back to some of these folks if you're interested. I will say that this such an inspiring story of what happened at Arequipa. It's perfect for Women's History Month, and I'm so glad that we got this in here because it's about strong and accomplished women, right, who are doing incredible work for vulnerable women. It's like it's got everything in it. I just love the whole idea and the story, and I really thank you for sharing it with us. This was incredible.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin. And if people want to get hold of me directly, they can go to my website, www.lindowney.com, and there's a contact button there.
Yeah, we're going to be sending that out in the email that we sent to everyone tomorrow, your website, the information about the book, which is also on the website if people are interested in getting that. And your contact information will be there as well.
Thanks
so that'll go out to everyone tomorrow. So if you didn't write that down, I mean, you can right now, lindowney.com. It's easy to remember. It's her name. You could reach out right now if you're interested. So thank you again, Lynn. This was incredible.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for attending this Book Club of California program tonight. Please join us for our next online program. It's called Gender Neutral, a contemporary look at women, typography, and book design on Monday, March 22nd. That's a week from tonight, from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. And this is going to be a live online presentation by Gloria Kondrup. She's a designer, educator, artist, and the executive director for the Huffmitz-Milken Center for Typography. You can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. I want to thank everybody again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. The parting words for tonight, I will say, I wish everyone a place of peace, a place of rest. As we learned tonight, that is what Arequipa means, right? In Peruvian. So think of that, Arequipa, a place of peace, a place of rest. Be well, everyone, and take care of yourself. And thank you for joining us.
Good night.
Good night.